So we will be doing a workshop today on framing and characterization. These are obviously two slightly different skills, but I think that they have a lot in common, which is why we've decided to group them together. So the way it works is I will give sort of a presentation, talk a little bit about how to frame and characterize, and then we'll take some questions. So I think the whole thing will be about an hour, maybe a little bit longer, depending on how many questions we get. So I'm going to just share my screen quickly. And can someone just confirm if you can see it?
Yeah, it's visible.
Excellent. Okay, so framing and characterization. So what I think these two things have in common is that they're kind of sneaky ways to increase your odds, because framing and characterization are both things that you're generally going to do sort of before you actually give an argument, or as you're setting up your argument, but before you've actually kind of given away what it is that you're getting at. And so they often then are able to come across as being a little bit more neutral and a little bit more sort of objective than the more partisan arguments that you might end up making. And the fact that I think judges sort of subconsciously will see them as being a little bit more neutral means that you can get away with being a little bit sneaky in terms of how you utilize framing and characterization to kind of weigh certain actors over others or prioritize one context for debate. So with that in mind, we'll talk about sort of what they are first, just in case anyone's unfamiliar with that, and then how to use them effectively. So starting with framing. Framing is basically picking the context in which the debate takes place. And so this is sort of like, if you can picture the whole screen as being like the potential ways in which this debate could go, or the areas where it might happen. Framing is really picking like a small part of that and saying, this is where we think this debate is most relevant. And there are a number of reasons why you might want to do that. Generally, it's going to be because you might have some arguments that are very effective in one context, but not very effective in another one. So maybe I have an argument that works really, really well in developing countries, but it doesn't work so well in developed countries, or vice versa. And if that's the case, then it might be in my interest to try to pretend that the debate only exists in the context where it favors me. So I can say, we think this is primarily going to be taking place in developed countries, give a few reasons why that's true. And then when I turn around and give an argument that works best in developed countries, then surprise, surprise, I've almost won the debate, because I've proven that in the most important context, my side wins. And so framing is very useful, especially if you know that there's maybe some contexts in which your arguments are going to lose. If you can sort of outframe those contexts, you preemptively refute some of the case that might come out of opposition in terms of how maybe they win in those scenarios. I will also just I want to highlight something, which is that framing is different from modeling, because I think especially when people are new to debate, or if you're in high school, no shade on high school debaters, but I find often coaches as sort of a way of introducing people to debate will heavily encourage things like modeling. And so often as part of a model, people will say like, this takes place in Canada, or this takes place in developed countries, or whatever. And sometimes you'll get away with that if you're debating other people that sort of have had similar training to you. But in BP, that's actually not really allowed. That kind of goes against the spirit of modeling, which is really just to clear up any uncertainties. And so in a good debate, you should get challenged on any kind of unfair modeling that tries to restrict the context. So if ever you want to limit it to something like developed countries or developing countries or Canada or whatever the case may be, there might be a temptation to model that in and to just kind of assert, this is where it takes place, this is how we define this house, but that's not really fair debating, and a good opponent is going to call you out on that. And so instead of using your model to kind of cherry pick where you want this to happen, you should use framing instead. Now, the difference is that unlike a model, which you can just sort of assert because other teams are supposed to give you fiat for that within reason, framing is something that you're going to need to prove. And so you can't just say like, this takes place in Canada with no reason why that's true. But you can sort of mechanize your framing the same way you mechanize an argument and justify why it takes place in a certain context. So if the motion is like, this house supports Justin Trudeau or something, we could say, well, clearly this takes place in Canada because most people who know who Trudeau is or care about him to any significant extent live in Canada. That's where the biggest impact is going to be. So we're fine to focus our arguments on that. So with that said, then, a few examples of sort of ways that you can frame things. And obviously, this is going to be really dependent on the motion, but one common one is to say that this debate primarily takes place in developed countries. This is often true if you're dealing with like an expensive policy motion or something. Often it makes sense to try to limit the debate to being in richer countries because the financial burden of implementing something like UBI is just so shockingly high that like a poorer country is maybe not going to be able to deal with that. And so often a good way of sort of framing and justifying this is why it takes place in developed countries is just to say, this is an incredibly expensive policy. This is a supports motion. We think that the most likely way in which this would happen is, in countries that are able to afford it. And so that's where we're going to concentrate our debate. And that allows you to sort of preempt some of the stuff from opposition about how this is going to be unaffordable for some countries, because you can explain why they're going to be super relevant. So with that said, then, I want to talk about characterization. I think there are a few people that are unmuted, so just mute yourselves. Otherwise, I will try to mute you. Okay, so characterization. So characterization, oh, I'm sorry, I just see there's, oh, yeah, Diggory wants to be a co-host. I can do that. Second. We don't seem to have co-host function, so Diggory's now the host. Okay. Having said that then, so what is characterization? So characterization is basically just a fancy word for describing something. And this is kind of the same way that like if you're reading a book and there are characters in it and the author probably spends some time, explaining who the characters are, describing their backstory, telling you what they're wearing, what they care about, what motivates them, all those types of things. That's basically what you should be doing in debate. And so it's kind of describing the actors or the countries or the context in which the debate takes place, but in a biased way that's going to favor you. And so, for example, teaching like as a profession is something that gets debated a lot. And so, you'll have motions about education. Should the state increase education? Should we decrease it? Should we, prioritize certain subjects in school or change the way that things get taught? And a lot of those motions end up having an impact on teachers. And depending on which side of the debate you're on, you might have an incentive to try to explain that teaching is actually a very difficult job, and so teachers deserve to get paid more. And so if you're trying to do that, and I'm not going to make any arguments here, but I will describe the teaching profession. And teaching, it's a really hard job. You have to get up before kids go to school. You have to wake up at 6 so you can get there at 7 so you can prepare your lesson plan. You have to supervise like 35 kids all day. Most parents only have 2 or 3 kids. Teachers have to look after 10 times that many for 8 hours a day. They have to stay late after school to clean up their classroom. They have to be like a parent to these children while also making sure that they learn things and making sure that they're safe and supervising them at recess. They don't get any breaks because there's no one to come in and give them a break while the kids are working. You have to constantly be on. And so this is really challenging. You have to deal with like crying children all the time, right? And if I describe it that way, then it sounds like teaching is maybe a very hard job. And maybe teachers deserve to get paid more or, deserve more benefits or something like that. But if I'm on opposition, again, without making any arguments, I can kind of describe teaching in a different way that's going to suggest that it's actually a really good job. So, teaching's really fun. You get to spend your time with little kids who love you. You get to do crafts all day. You get to often have 2 or 3 months off every summer. You finish work at the same time as your children, so you can pick them up from school. It's a government job, so it's super stable because we need teachers even in times of economic difficulty. It pays pretty well under the status quo because teachers have really strong unions. And so if I describe it that way, it sounds like maybe teachers have a pretty good deal and they actually don't need to get paid more, or they don't need any more benefits, or, maybe it would be okay to impose an additional burden on them to teach in a new way because, hey, they already have it pretty good. So characterization can be very powerful, especially because it's kind of sneaky. And so in both cases, I'm not saying anything that's like untrue, but I am sort of selectively presenting the truth and, only describing the advantages or only describing the disadvantages. And so characterization is basically any time that you kind of describe how an actor is, or how a country is, or any sort of thing that's going to be relevant to the debate when you spend a little bit of time describing it. So what's the difference then? The difference is really that framing is a way of narrowing the debate to something that suits you. And characterization is a way to sort of make the best of the debate once it's already being narrowed. So if you're dealing with something like a policy motion, often that's going to be really broad, and you can narrow that to a specific country or a particular context where you think that's most likely going to be effective. But sometimes you're handed a debate that really is quite specific already. So, this house believes that this person should do X thing. In that case, you can't really narrow it down beyond that one person, but you can really try to describe that person in a way that's going to favor the arguments that you are going to make. So this isn't to say that they're mutually exclusive. You should definitely always be doing framing as well as characterization, but they sort of serve a slightly different purpose, and depending on the debate, one or the other might be more or less important. I find characterization is often particularly important when you are dealing with a very specific actor. So when it's an actor motion, so this house as whoever would do whatever, then it's important to characterize who the actor is. But also if it's like this house believes that China should do X thing, then you should be thinking about, well, how do I want to characterize China? Okay, so let's talk then about how to sort of use framing characterization in an effective way. So starting with framing, you should try to pick your frame. I think during prep time, or if you're back half while you're thinking of your extension, it should be sort of an ongoing process that happens as you're developing your arguments. And the first thing I want to highlight here is that you need to be still somewhat realistic. So as much as it's tempting sometimes to completely outframe everything to only your absolute best case scenario, that's usually not going to come across as being super likely or plausible, which takes away the sort of sneakiness advantage of framing. Because as soon as it becomes obvious to your judge that you're just like actively lying to them, they're going to be much more skeptical when looking at your case, and they're more likely to sort of identify flaws or kind of gut check things and say, hey, maybe that's not right. So when you're framing, you want to try to be realistic. And so I find sometimes it's helpful to think about possible frames sort of before you pick your arguments. And so, if we're talking about what should China do, let's think about what are the possible things that maybe might be most important. So maybe it's about the economy. Maybe it's going to be about social policy. Maybe it's going to be about like strategic sort of military positioning in the South China Sea. These are all sort of plausible things that China might care a lot about. But I probably don't want to frame this as being about like, I don't know, panda diplomacy or something. Like, yes, this is probably something that they do, but it's probably not their biggest priority. And so you do have a lot of options, but you need to keep them realistic. And similarly, you want to accept some kind of trade-off. So, for example, a lot of the time I find people will try to frame things as taking place in democracies. And this makes sense. Like if you're dealing with a motion about changing the voting system, for example, then obviously this is going to be most effective in countries that have some kind of democracy because, hey, if it's a dictatorship, like we're not voting anyways, so this probably doesn't apply. But I think it's often a little bit uncharitable to try to restrict this exclusively to like the best functioning democracies in the world and be like, this only takes place in like Norway. Because that's not super realistic. Your judge is probably going to oppose that. And so instead, a better frame is probably going to be something like functional democracies. So countries that have a democracy, it largely works, but maybe there's a little bit of corruption sometimes. Maybe it doesn't always work perfectly. Maybe we're thinking about countries like Peru or India or Malaysia or something where, yeah, there's democracy, but at times it's a little bit flawed. And obviously this will also include the more sort of stable democracies, the Finlands of the world. But in order to be sort of somewhat charitable and still make sure you've got a fair debate, you want to make sure there's some kind of trade-off available within your frame. I will also just highlight here that it's much more likely that your opposition is going to like buy into your framing and sort of engage on the terms that you have set if it is a frame that they feel like they can maybe win with. And this doesn't mean it has to be fair, but you maybe want it to be like 40-60 odds or 30-70. You don't want it to be like 95-5, because if that's the case, then it's more likely that they're going to just reject your framing altogether. So if I try to say this only happens in the best democracies in the world, opposition is probably just going to respond and say, that's ridiculous. We think it happens absolutely everywhere. But if I say we think that this happens in functional democracies, then they're more likely to say, okay, this is true, but in some instances, there might be some corruption. And that's a much more manageable argument for you to contend with. They're already going to be at a bit of a disadvantage. And so it's in your interest to try to sort of set fair framing that's going to acknowledge some kind of trade-off, although ideally that sort of avoids maybe the worst possible arguments from opposition. You should also, I think, just briefly consider framing options before you pick your arguments. So think about, like, just intuitively, where is this motion likely to take place? And this is where you maybe don't want to be biased, and you can just be honest with yourself and say, well, actually, like, most poor countries are located in like the global south. Most of them are in like relatively tropical environments. And so maybe, this argument about climate change is going to be relevant or not relevant or whatever. Or, if we're talking about education, well, maybe this is most impactful in elementary schools because that's when kids are youngest and most impressionable, and there's the greatest number of them in school. And so ask yourself those questions, I think, right off the bat to figure out where you think the motion sort of is inherently most impactful, and then see if you can think of arguments that maybe fit one of those contexts, and then from there sort of develop your framing. So it's something you should be sort of going back and forth between your framing, your arguments, to try to make them work together and come to something that's going to be favorable to you, but still realistic, still sort of intuitive to the average judge, and also importantly to the average opponent. Once you've kind of picked your frame, then you should start trying to sort of prove it. And the way that you do this, first thing on here, obviously, don't be assertive. So don't just say, we think that this takes place in X scenario. Explain why you think it likely takes place in the context that you've set out. So, we think that this likely takes place in functional democracies because, the impact of a change to the democratic system is going to be greatest in countries where democracy works. You think that this motion is most likely to happen in richer countries because they're the ones that are able to implement it and thus would be most likely to adopt it. We think this maybe mostly takes place in religious countries because in those countries, you've got a very strong sense of sort of shared morality that people buy into, as opposed to maybe in a more secular country where a lot of people have sort of different religions and different conceptions of right and wrong. So identify sort of where you think it takes place, and then give reasons why it takes place in this context and mechanize your framing. I think I've already given a few examples of this, but basically you want to try to explain your framing the same way that you would explain any of your arguments. So this is why we think it takes place in these circumstances. Usually the way that you do this is just by saying that we think that this is going to have the highest impact or create the biggest possible change in X, Y, and Z circumstance, which is why we should focus the debate there. So this narrative is mostly going to change the minds of people who are already on the fence. So that's who we should focus on in this debate. Things like that, it's almost like weighing, except you're doing it preemptively. And so you're trying to identify where is this going to be most impactful, why should we prioritize it, and then you prioritize it accordingly. One other thing I'll say here is sometimes there's going to be maybe a relatively obvious alternative. If that's true, then you should be prepared to respond to that. So you should be able to say, we think that this likely takes place in developed countries. I know opposition might claim that this maybe takes place in developing countries, but here's why that's not likely. And so something like that, I think, can be good. If there isn't just one obvious alternative, then I would say don't preempt too explicitly, because maybe you're just giving opposition ideas at that point. But do sort of bear it in mind and be prepared to defend your framing later on, especially if you're in a relatively good room. Opposition is probably going to come up there with their own framing and try to sort of outframe you. Okay, finally then, just a quick example. So this is one that was set at Chancellor's this year. I had quite a lot of fun debating this one. So the motion is, this House believes that Indigenous groups should engage in eco-terrorism. And we were closing government here. And I framed this as primarily taking place in South America. And this was favorable to me because our case was basically that eco-terrorism, this is when you like commit terrorism to try to get environmental benefits. We basically said eco-terrorism is going to take place against like big sort of extractive companies, so oil companies, other like resources that are doing horrible things like, you know, burning down the Amazon to get to set up farms and stuff like that. And so we said it's, you know, it's going to be against them. It's good because you just make it expensive for them to do business and you force them to come to the table, negotiate some kind of deal with you to basically get you to stop destroying their stuff. And then you're going to have like indigenous groups that are maybe going to get, you know, some kind of compromise on these projects, maybe like better working conditions if their communities are involved, maybe a share of the profits, all sorts of good things. But in order to do this, we needed it to take place in a context in which, you know, maybe the government isn't as able to intervene, or in which it's likely that those are the kinds of companies that you use this against. And Latin America is a good place to set that because in a lot of those countries, you know, there are sometimes slightly weaker sort of central government control over more peripheral regions. Often like big American companies are going to be really influential, but they're not native to whatever country they're extracting oil in. And so the central government doesn't have a ton of control over them and is also sort of economically dependent. And so you really need to bring the corporations to the table. The government can't intervene. And so with all that in mind, we framed it in South America. And our reasoning for that is basically, well, most indigenous people live in South America. Like in North America, most of them died when it got colonized. And so there are a few of them, but it's a relatively small number. They're not super influential. And in most other places, there just aren't as many indigenous people, or like everyone is sort of indigenous. And so, you know, most people in the country are like ethnically Chinese or whatever. And so there isn't necessarily like this sort of significant plurality of indigenous people that has political power, but also is sort of in opposition to a dominant group. And so Latin America is unique in the sense that in a lot of the countries there, you do have like 30, maybe 40% of the population that's indigenous, which is enough to cause really significant change by doing things like eco-terrorism, but not enough to already be in control and have, you know, the ability to use other means to sort of address these issues. And so we sort of use that to mechanize our framing and to prove like this is why that's where that takes place. And then once we had set that up, it was quite easy to run our argument because it worked very well in the context in which we had set up the round. This also has the added benefit often of if you reframe from back half, just immediately outweighing everyone on front half. So our front half in that round had largely been focusing on like indigenous people in Canada and what they should do. And as soon as we gave our framing, we were like, look, we have so much more impact if we're dealing with South America, where like 40% of the population is indigenous, that's millions of people, as opposed to the like 4% of the population in Canada, which is maybe like 1 million if we're generous. So handy trick is always like reframe the debate from CG. Okay, any questions on framing before I move on to characterization? And we will have sort of like broad questions at the end, but if anyone has like anything specific, ask me now or I might forget. Okay, so I will go on to characterization then. This is good. I think we're largely on schedule, which is nice. Okay, so characterization. When should you characterize? And I think this is useful. Don't characterize just for the sake of characterizing. Like, don't just characterize because you think, oh, I should describe stuff. That's not really going to be super effective in your debate. You should really only be characterizing in contexts where it's going to be useful to you. That said, it's pretty much always going to be useful. So you should characterize in every debate. It's just a question of which things should you spend time characterizing. So the first sort of rule of thumb is anytime that there is an important actor in the motion, which is basically just anytime there is any actor in the motion, you should spend some time characterizing that person. So it's this house as the Pope, describe what the Pope likely, feels like, what he cares about, what his goals are, all those types of things. If it's this house as Russia, describe what Russia likes. If it's this house as Taylor Swift, describe what she cares about. Also, if it's like a broader class of actors, so like this house, like as a parent, In those cases, you're not going to know necessarily who the actor is, but you can make the sort of decision to say, we think the parent likely, is middle class. And obviously there are going to be some people that are like lower class or upper class parents, but most parents are going to be middle class. So we think that's probably who you are. In most cases, and I think this is often quite good, there's a 50% chance that you might be a woman. And so, that's something that you should maybe be factoring into the decision. And so consider sort of elements like that when you're characterizing. But anytime the motion or info slide tells you about an actor, you should be prepared to characterize them and like who they are, what they care about, what they're prepared to do together. The other time that you should characterize is anytime that your case is dependent on someone acting a certain way. So this is particularly true, like anytime that you say that someone has an incentive to do something, you need to characterize to prove sort of why they have that incentive and also why they're likely to act on it. So, parents have an incentive to put their kids in the best school. Why? Well, because parents care a lot about their children. And so you want to maybe describe what a parent looks like, what they value, why they care so much about their kids, why this maybe matters more than other things to them. Because those are going to be quite relevant in the context of the debate. Similarly, like if you're doing an IR motion and your case is like China is going to react poorly to this, then it's really important you don't just assert that, because then you're probably going to lose because some other team is going to be like, no, they won't. And so you need to be able to describe, what are their incentives? How have they reacted in previous situations like this? Why are they likely to continue reacting this way? What do they care about? Okay, so next slide then, how do you characterize? So the first thing I want to highlight here, and this is like really easy and quick characterization, use the info slide or the motion to your advantage. Sometimes the motion or the info slide is going to sort of feed you ideas or facts that are sort of taken for granted about a particular actor that you can use to your benefit. So if the info slide says like you are an immigrant, then you can use that and you can say, look, you're an immigrant. This probably means you moved to the country you live in now quite recently. Maybe you don't have a ton of money because, perhaps your home country wasn't as wealthy as the country you moved to. Maybe that's why you moved. And so that kind of tells you something about the actor. If it says you're a doctor, that also tells you things, right? It says, you're probably a pretty smart person if you were able to get here. You're probably relatively wealthy because doctors usually get paid a lot. Maybe you're ambitious because it takes a lot of sort of drive to get you through medical school. And so those are sort of characteristics that you can then apply to explain how you're going to react in future scenarios. So if you're relatively ambitious, we think this means that you're likely to want to do things like, I don't know, take a risk, run for political office, encourage your children to do really well in school because you did. And so things like that, you can kind of extrapolate from the motion. And a lot of the time, those are just sort of free points because there's no real way to contest that, right? Like if the info slide says something is true, then you take that for granted. And so if it says like you have historically had good relations with China, then this is just true, right? And you can use that in the debate to say, well, historically, we've had great relations. Maybe we're going to continue to have those in the future. And so don't underestimate the value of the info slide. I know sometimes people will see it as like, well, if I already know something about the topic, I don't need to look at the info slide carefully. But I think you should be wary of that because even if you know everything in the info slide, just by virtue of the fact of it being in the info slide, that stuff is no longer spec knowledge. It is like canon. It is something that is taken for granted. We know 100% for sure that this is true in the context of the debate. And so you can use that as an absolute ironclad premise when debating something. So look carefully at the info slide, see if there's anything you can use to characterize your actor. These are going to be sort of the fastest ways to characterize because it's already there and you don't need to do the legwork of like giving examples and stuff to prove that like you're probably, very smart or ambitious or whatever, if you sort of have that fiated in. The other thing as well that I think is useful when characterizing is this is a place where I think it can be more useful than in other contexts to integrate spec knowledge. And obviously do this in moderation, because if you overdo it, the same way that if you overdo your framing, your judge is going to be like, that doesn't really seem intuitive. If you overdo it with the spec, someone's going to call you on it. But you can usually get away with a little bit more than you could in terms of like using spec to support like a link in your mechanization or something. So you can get away with a little bit more spec knowledge. And this is where it's useful, I think, to just use it as an illustration of something. So if the info slide says that you're married, maybe you want to characterize why this is probably not a great marriage. And so you can say stuff like, look, 50% of marriages end in divorce. And that's like, a pretty well-known fact. Maybe it's a little bit specky, but it sort of supports your claim that perhaps, even though you're married, this isn't an awesome marriage. Another stat that always comes up is like the average American can't afford a $400 unexpected expense, I think is a common one. At least I hear that a lot in debates. And again, this one is sort of a little bit more esoteric. I don't know how much the average informed voter would know about this, but if you're trying to characterize something and say like, maybe you're middle class, maybe you're poor, maybe it's financially difficult for you to do whatever thing the motion's proposing, when you're characterizing that, you can use a little bit of spec to kind of support that and say, look, like most people can't afford this unexpected expense. You're most people, probably you can't afford it either. This is going to be really hard on you financially. You can also use a little bit of rhetoric, especially if you're like giving a prime minister speech and you start out with some characterization, some framing to set up the round. Then it's useful to sort of do some repetition, maybe crack some jokes depending on the motion, and use those sort of strategies to get your audience engaged. And I think also just to sort of build up your ethos, make yourself seem credible, and make them more inclined to believe that what you're saying is just objectively true, as opposed to, biased sort of description. So one example then of characterization, and so I've got a motion here. And it's got a big info slide. It says, tiger parenting is a term which refers to strict or demanding parents who push their children to be successful academically by attaining high levels of scholastic and academic achievement, sometimes to the detriment of the child's social, psychological, and emotional well-being. This house, as an immigrant parent, would raise their children using the tiger parenting model. So based on this motion, we can just look at it and see you're an immigrant and you're a parent. And so these are probably two important things to characterize so that we know how the actor is likely to behave and why maybe they're likely to prioritize this. So, you're an immigrant. Usually when people immigrate, they do it for a reason, like not just for fun. Generally, that's going to be for like economic sort of success. Often it's because they want a better life for their children. And often the consequence of that is that they move to sort of a more developed country, and therefore often a more expensive country than the one that they come from initially. And so even if you're maybe upper class in the country that you came from, if you then move to like Finland and it's really expensive to live there, you're going to be like middle class, maybe lower class. So you're maybe in financial difficulty. Maybe it's important based on that your kid get a really good job. And so, education is going to be really essential to that. Maybe if you're prepared to make a big sacrifice, like picking up and moving countries to give your children a better life, then you probably care a lot about your children. You care a lot about their success. Maybe you want to make sure your decision pays off. Maybe you have perhaps seen the value of education if you got a job in the new country you moved to. Maybe it's because you speak the language or something. Perhaps you care a lot about that and want your children to have the same benefits. And so you're able to sort of use these characteristics to try to describe how you think people are likely to behave or what they likely value. And again, we can talk about parents generally, just say like, look, parents care a lot about their children and they're prepared to make big sacrifices for them. They often love them more than anything else. This is why, like, even though it's really hard to have a kid and it's really expensive and it makes you, have to get up in the middle of the night to go feed your baby, these are still things that people choose to do because they really value having kids. And so you probably care a lot about your kid. And so depending on sort of which side of the motion you're on, you might want to focus on different aspects of this, right? And so if you're on government, you probably want to characterize how much you want your child to be successful long-term and why maybe that's important to you as a parent, perhaps as an immigrant as well. Why do you think that's going to be best for the child? But if you're in opposition, maybe you characterize it differently and you say, look, you care the most about your child's like well-being. Maybe you moved here to get out of a dangerous country. Maybe you're trying to, give them a life where they have more choices than they did back home. And the best way to do that is not by tiger parenting, it's to let them take their own approach. And so depending on sort of which side you get, you can use different parts of this info slide or the motion to try to characterize in a way that's going to favor your arguments. Okay, so that's sort of the end of the lesson per se. I do know there were a number of questions on the forum when people registered, so I'm going to go answer those. And in the meantime, if you guys have any other questions, either specifically about framing and characterization or more broadly about like debate, feel free to either put those in the chat or to unmute. Like I mentioned at the start, this is being recorded, so if you ask it like out loud, your voice might be recorded for a few minutes. But otherwise, you can always put it in the chat, or you can like privately message Diggory, and I'm sure he can repeat it. Okay, so then in terms of questions that we got, so someone asked how to use framing as refutation. I think that the easiest way to do this is just to sort of outframe something someone else said. So it's kind of like weighing in the sense that you say, well, sure, whatever they said applies in that context, but that context is a very small part of the debate. We think it's not the most important one for whatever reason. The most important one is actually this context, and then you focus back on your argument. So I think framing is just sort of another way of outweighing someone else in refutation. Someone asked how to frame different types of motions. So like economics motions, social norm motions, regrets motions, things like that. So I think I've talked a little bit about economy stuff. I think the most important difference there is often going to be like developed versus developing countries. I think for a lot of social norm ones, so like this house supports whatever belief, this house regrets whatever belief. Often I think it's useful to sort of frame the debate as being about the people that are going to be most likely to buy into that or whatever. And that's again where characterization kind of play into that. But so if we're talking about like, should religions teach X thing, then the debate is going to be most impactful to people who are already religious, because they're the ones that are going to be most significantly influenced by that. Another way that you can go with sort of these softer like narrative motions is to try to sort of frame it very restrictively. And I like doing this sometimes on back half to kind of make front half seem irrelevant. But this is where you say, like, look, this belief isn't really going to change how anyone acts. So the motion like this has belief, or this has supports the belief that patience is a virtue, for example. We can say like, look, just because you believe this doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be more patient or not. Like there are lots of reasons why people might act in a patient or an impatient way. But what it does do is it changes the way that people feel about the actions that they're going to take regardless. And so if you think patience is a virtue, maybe you don't become patient more often, but if you're forced to be patient, if you have to wait a long time to like get that job you really care about, or to see the benefits from you practicing debate every day, maybe you feel a little bit more satisfied. Even if you're not immediately seeing progress, you're going to say, this is great. I'm like, at least I'm sort of getting there. Patience is a good thing. You can kind of, pat yourself on the back for believing in patience. And similarly, like there are often motions about like finding meaning in work. And so this has like regrets the narrative that like work should be meaningful or whatever. Often you'll see sort of big impact arguments on front half about why we want people to be looking for meaningful jobs or why we don't want that. But a good back half is often just to outframe that and say, actually, like we think most people don't have a choice about what kind of job they do. They don't have a choice of like how many hours they work. They just have to do these things to get by. But what this narrative does change is how they feel about the hours that they have to work regardless. And if they feel that they're like hustling and grinding and this is a really good thing, they're maybe going to be happier, even if they're doing the exact same thing either way. And so that's sort of one suggestion I would have for framing some of those sort of softer motions. in terms of, someone was asking how to like characterize briefly but in depth. I think that often there is, unfortunately, a bit of a trade-off between depth and brevity. Listing a lot of examples can sometimes sort of give you a little bit more credibility and make it seem like you know what you're talking about when you're trying to sort of assert things in your characterization. So that doesn't hurt. The other thing, like I said, is I think you can use the info slide as a shortcut sometimes. But truly, I think the real solution here is just focus on characterizing the most important actors. And if something's not going to be beneficial to your case, then don't bother with the characterization. Okay, there are a couple of questions in the chat. Let me just take a look at those. Some examples of framing and characterization. So there were a couple in the presentation, but a few more. So examples of framing, you can do like, we think this mostly takes place in democracies. We think this mostly impacts like new graduates, new workers. We think this mostly impacts countries that are really vulnerable to climate change, all those sort of options. In terms of characterization, again, just like describing things differently. So, you know, we think that Putin is really, you know, volatile. Like, look, he invaded Ukraine. He was prepared to risk sanctions. He's super unpredictable. This is very bad. Or the alternative of like, we think that he has very limited options right now. He's going to be risk averse. You know, he's already been sanctioned. He's already sort of on the brink of failure. He can't afford to take any more risks right now because the situation is so precarious. And so different ways there that you can frame stuff. Sometimes you use framing to narrow down the scale of effect at the same time. So I don't think that there's anything wrong actually with narrowing the scope of the impact when you narrow the scope of the debate with your framing. So like I was saying before with like the jobs example, if you say like, we think this doesn't change the jobs people get, but it does change like the way that they feel about them. I think that as long as you're able to prove that like this actually doesn't change the big impact, if you can win on the small impact, you're good to go. And so I think maybe just to add a little bit of meta debating to sort of explain why that's the case. So like, look, opposition is trying to claim that this is going to change the type of job that you get. They have not mechanized why that happens. We've given you several reasons why, you know, this is unlikely to be the tipping point that changes the job that you get. However, we have proven that this makes like everyone in the world feel 5% better about the crappy jobs they have to do. And so we're able to outweigh just because that's a much more certain impact. We've actually proven it, and we think it impacts a greater number of people. If you are trying to avoid like limiting, you know, the scale of the effect or whatever, I think just frame it in the situation that's going to be most impactful. So like I was saying with the motion where we like narrowed it down to like South America, that is still where most Indigenous people live. And so it's not a huge loss in terms of magnitude of impact, but it does make it a much cleaner debate because you don't have to deal with as many like messy what if situations, because there aren't going to be as many sort of different contexts. And so I think if that's a concern, then, you know, pick a scenario that has a big impact, but is just a little bit more precise and hopefully more favorable to your side than on op. But definitely don't be afraid of sort of accepting the trade-off and saying, yes, this is a narrower impact, but it's more important. Any other questions from anyone? Agree, anything to add? If not, we've got a couple upcoming events that I think we'll talk about quickly.
The only thing I might add is I think sometimes it's very helpful to like frame something by analogy. So one thing you can do is just say, we think this is going to be very similar to this phenomena that the judge is familiar with. So perhaps like we can say, we think this is going to be similar to like Biden's, you know, recent sort of he sort of spends a bunch of money on American businesses. So we think this is like the America First policy. If you're going to talk about, you know, legalizing something, you can go, obviously this isn't going to be fully legal. We think it's similar to like restrictions on alcohol or cigarettes. And everybody knows what you mean. You don't have to talk about what every single restriction is going to be, and you can just quickly frame things in a very sensible way that people are going to be familiar with. So I think you can do that often to take a little bit of a shortcut and maximize the kind of like how much depth do you put in versus thing, or like how much depth do you go into versus how much time do you spend. That's a way you can kind of shortcut that trade-off. Also, yes, we'll be posting the lecture eventually. I can't remember. I don't think we've back posted some of the others, but we'll be posting them all.
Yeah, I think they'll probably get posted over Christmas holidays once we're done with exams, but we will be sending out sort of the link to an unedited version of this by email to everyone who had initially registered. So if you missed the start or you want to like rewatch it because the insights were that good, then definitely feel free. Any other questions before we talk about our events? Okay, so I don't see any questions, so I'm going to stop the recording.